Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
George Washington in the Revolution is, in a certain sense, George Washington throughout his career. It's really very difficult to segment the aspects of George Washington's contribution. He said at the end of his farewell address in 1796 that he had spent 45 years working in the public service, in the service of his country. And of course, 45 years carries you back before the country even existed, which means then during the period of the Revolution, what we're seeing is that George Washington is engaged in a deliberate effort leading beyond the immediate context of the Revolution towards the eventual founding of the United States. So in 1775, when George Washington assumes command of the Army of the United States, he addresses his troops, sends out general orders in which he says to them, "We are now the servants of the United Provinces of North America. It is time to forget our colonial distinctions." He begins emphasizing union, and he leads the revolutionary effort with that in mind. Through the course of the war, of course, which was an extremely difficult war, there were ups and downs. There were periods of grave danger and even threatened failure. But his leadership meant that he had to persevere to sustain an army which was ill-supplied, which was ill-fed, and which was often on the run, and in the face of a governmental system which of course hardly existed. The Continental Congress initially, the Confederation Congress after 1777, these proved largely ineffective. They were unable to gain from the states the kinds of financial support needed to sustain a military effort. They had difficulty even getting recruits into the service because people would enter the army for short periods and then go home, and they'd have to reconstitute and retrain. So Washington, during the Revolution itself, found himself in the position at least one scholar has referred to, and indeed that scholar was Woodrow Wilson before he became President of the United States, as effectively the master of the United States, the only one who could hold it together, the only glue or cement to the emerging political union. The Revolutionary War was therefore primarily a test of direct leadership by George Washington in circumstances in which no leadership at all was favored with respect to the circumstances of the Americans. Anyone who was betting should have bet that the British would win. They should not have bet on George Washington at any point. This is underscored by Washington's own sentiments at the time that he accepted the command that was conferred upon him. He wrote back to his wife, he wrote to others, "I don't know why I'm doing it, apart from the fact that my country calls me. I don't think I'm up to it. I don't know that I won't do anything but fail, and that I feel miserable because I can't see any possibility of succeeding in this." But at some level, we have to understand that Washington, who was characteristically diffident, who throughout his entire life always understated his competence, his ability, and his confidence, that in some measure he was also downplaying expectations, leading people to, at the same time, to be resolved and yet steeled against disappointment. And that's the spirit in which Washington conducted the military affairs during the Revolution. Washington's role in the politics of the United States actually begins with the Revolution. And so we need to see a transcendence taking place. There comes a time in 1776 when Washington addresses a letter to John Augustine Washington, his brother, in which he's describing the political situation, not the military situation. And he says, We are at a moment when we need to form our constitutions, and we can't do that too carefully. It takes infinite care in order to prepare properly a constitution which is going to last for the prosperity of millions yet unborn. So we see at the outset, Washington begins by framing political evolution in the United States as a matter of intelligent design. And that continues as he conducts the Army in its interactions with the Congress. And in 1783, when he resigns the military command, and he sends a political testament to the governors of the 13 states to be transmitted to all the peoples, in which political testament he says, we have an urgent necessity to constitute a firm union and to establish principles of justice to guide us. And moreover, to further our ability to place particular local private interests second to the interest of the larger community. That is the spirit which led ultimately to the Constitutional Convention. George Washington in the Constitutional Convention was, of course, elected president or chairman, however you want to think of that. And in being put in that position, he was officially silent in the Constitutional Convention, officially silent. But of course, the convention conducted most of its business in a committee of the whole. And that meant George Washington was not in the chair. It was only when the convention reconvened as convention that he was in the chair. And he sat with his delegation. So we can trace some of his contributions to the convention from the notes about the conversations in the convention, which show that Washington's positions in the Virginia delegation bear some affinity with positions of the leading members of the Pennsylvania delegation, for example, and that had a lot to do with shaping the direction and the outcome of the Constitutional Convention. One critical point comes with the Connecticut Compromise. There was, in addition to having a Senate with equal number of members from each state, and therefore a proportionally represented House of Representatives, the compromise between the large states and the small states, there was also a provision that money bills would originate in the House of Representatives. Except that supposed element of the compromise was not accepted by the people to whom it was offered. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, the other Federalists were not at all interested in this money bill provision. And so the whole deliberation was hung up. It was suspended until they could find some way to forge agreement and move ahead with the Connecticut Compromise. That moment came when George Washington switched his vote from nay to yea, and therefore carried the Virginia delegation and moved the entire convention forward. So we can find moments like this, as we do at the end of the convention, when all has been done, the Constitution has been completed, and it's ready to be signed and sealed, and an motion is made that says, can we change the formula of representation, which had been written to say 1 for 40,000, to make it 1 for 30,000? And George Washington at that moment steps out of the presidential chair and says, I don't normally speak, but I will speak. And I will ask that this be done because I think it's important to satisfy the democratic sentiments of our society. He then was silent. No one else spoke. The convention unanimously approved, as he has requested, this change, even after the Constitution had been completed. What is his role in the Constitution? I would say George Washington's role in the Constitution was to provide the leadership, the structure, the architectural principle that held the convention together. George Washington enjoyed, in some ways, peculiar relationships with many of the other founders. The James Madisons, the Alexander Hamiltons, the Thomas Jeffersons, even the Benjamin Franklins in a certain way. Because George Washington had ascended in an important manner to a status, an elevation in the United States that was rivaled by none other than perhaps Benjamin Franklin. In 1777, citizens of the United States began celebrating his birthday spontaneously. There was no law, no declaration that it should be. They just held public celebrations. So all these people with whom he had to work in association, in deliberation, with extensive correspondence, in leading towards the establishment of the Constitutional Convention and the eventual approval, ratification of the Constitution, were people who at one and the same time became intimates and yet retained a certain distance. They were people who wouldn't exactly call him George, i.e. first name was not the basis of the relationship, but who at the same time would develop high degrees of confidence and reliance in interacting because they were engaged in a common effort. And you see this in the case of Washington and James Madison, because leading up to the Constitutional Convention, they exchanged correspondence in which Madison entrusts Washington with an outline of what he thinks the convention, the Constitution, the future ought to look like. And Washington sends directives to James Madison saying, we must aim high. It is better to seek the best than to fear failure in this circumstance. So let us try no temporizing expedients, Washington said. Let us put our best foot forward and let the chips fall where they may. Following the ratification of the Convention of the Constitution, we have, of course, a new government, and Washington has to become president. What happens? Many people have to encourage him to accept the presidency, just as they had to encourage him to attend the convention in the first place. James Madison was one of the primary interlocutors who sought to persuade Washington to take this leading role. And so when the government is now being instituted in 1789, because the Constitution has been approved, Washington turns to Madison. It is Madison whom he will call upon to draft ultimately his first inaugural address. It is Madison who, writing the response to the inaugural address from the House of Representatives, will be called upon again by Washington to write Washington's response to the House's response. When Washington gets a response from the Senate, he calls on Madison to write the response to the Senate response. It sounds, I know, like Madison is carrying on a dialogue with himself, doing all this writing. But the point, of course, is that Washington's reliance upon him said something about what Washington expected and what Madison could count on in their relationship. What Washington had said to James Madison is, look, we're at the outset. We're just starting out. And everything we do will become a precedent. And so we must be sure we get the precedents right. So the moment when there were no precedents at all, he was thoughtful. He was prepared. He was willing to see what the future would look like. As I said earlier, it's intelligent design. It's evolution, but it's not by chance. So Madison and Washington were partners in shaping the government. And as that partnership developed, under the first couple of years, Washington was relying upon Madison as effectively a prime minister, because Madison was a member of the House of Representatives, and he led the government. He introduced the amendments which became the Bill of Rights with Washington's approval. Now, of course, after a little more time has transpired, they become somewhat distant because partisanship enters the picture. Political parties begin to grow. And James Madison with Thomas Jefferson become leaders of the new Republican Party, while Washington is the titular head of the Federalist Party, the administration. So they had a close relationship. They were intimates. They relied upon one another, but they were also independent intellects. They were strong characters each. They could pursue, as their understanding informed them, different political goals. Never parting, I would submit, from the fundamental goal of making the Constitution work. George Washington, with respect to slavery, was, I would say from the beginning, a quasi-slave owner. It is to be certain that he owned, bought, sold slaves in the course of his life, though it must be understood that he began with simply having inherited, received slaves, and then stepped into the full exercise of the relationship, the profession, the business. But he gradually became doubtful about the propriety of slavery. As his commitment to republicanism grew, so grew also his doubt about the rightfulness of slavery. And he eventually matured and became profoundly anti-slavery. This shows up in policy when the Jay Treaty is approved in 1795, ratified by Washington, confirmed by the Senate eventually. It leaves out a critical provision, the provision for the return of the slave property that had been carried away in the Revolutionary War, and which was one of the chief demands of the Americans as they sought to settle the outstanding issues from the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which settled the Revolutionary War. He left it out. He left it out because, as is described in an essay by Alexander Hamilton, it is against the law of nature and it is morally inappropriate. Washington also gave public testimony about the wrongfulness of slavery, while hoping to lead even the Virginia legislature to do something to establish manumission, abolition. He was disappointed about that because they didn't do it. He expressed that disappointment, but it remained fundamentally private. There was, however, also a fundamentally private resolve, which comes to its full fruition in his will, his final testimony and testament, in which he sets free his own slaves. But he doesn't do it immediately, and that has led some people to doubt that he was serious, because he said they will be free upon the death of his wife, Martha. But what people fail to understand is what Washington was doing was guaranteeing that all the slaves would indeed be free, because the law, the common law at the time, declared a widow's third of any estate, no matter what the will of the decedent might have been, so that his purpose could have been defeated had he not tied it to the death of Martha and freed it from the condition of the widow's third. So Washington gave at least that testimony to the country. His will becomes public. The public knows, once it is revealed, that he thinks slavery is wrong, the slaves should be freed, and that they should be provided for, as he provided in his will. And I might say one more thing. It's important to see that merely freeing slaves is not necessarily a very generous thing to do, because they are freed in the face of an important question: what do I do? Where do I go? Washington had to build his estate, his resources, to achieve the position he finally achieved of being able to provide for the slaves that he freed, which he did. Washington's role in achieving the ratification of the Constitution is a fairly complex one. It begins, of course, all the way back in 1783. It begins as we progress towards the Annapolis Convention in 1786. That's the convention that leads to the call of the Constitutional Convention. That had been preceded by a Mount Vernon conference. That was all tied up with Washington's plans for building a network of canals that would eventually connect the Ohio River with the Potomac and other rivers. So Washington's ambition, his vision for an empire in the United States, was part and parcel of the process of developing the Constitution and then fighting for its ratification. Washington did not take an open public role in the ratification debate. He wrote no essays. He published no opinions. He was even careful in his correspondence, because he knew his correspondence often would become open to the public, whether someone had intercepted it along the way or the recipients had turned it over. But he stayed in constant contact with the people who were engaged in carrying on the political campaign. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison in particular, those two foremost, but many others besides. What he did was to, as he himself said, read every single thing that had been published and form a judgment about it and communicate with others about what needed to be done to shore up the effort to secure approval, ratification of the Constitution. He was anxious about it. He was anxious about the state of Virginia, where Patrick Henry was thundering forth with great thunderbolts of opposition, calling those who had approved the Constitution unfaithful to the promise of liberty in the Virginia Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence. So Washington was there in the heat of it in terms of his awareness, in terms of his communication with individuals privately, and in a sense in terms of giving direction. But he was completely invisible from a public perspective, not stepping forth publicly either to sit in the convention or to take a position announced in public presses. The Constitution, of course, in its Article 2 establishes an executive power. It says the executive power of the United States shall be larger than the President of the United States. It doesn't say much more about what that means, what this executive power consists of. It has a certain relationship with the legislature. There's a reliance upon advice and consent with the Senate with regard to forming treaties and approving appointments to offices or judgeships. But otherwise, it's really a blank slate waiting to be filled in. And it was Washington's task to fill it in. Washington was self-conscious about that task. He was self-conscious as he was in the beginning, wanting to establish precedents and make sure that they were clear and that they adhered to principle. And he was self-conscious in recognizing the need to interpret the Constitution. It was not a self-enforcing, self-interpreting document. It had to be given the flesh and bones that would make it a living experience. So Washington understood that what he would do would be not merely the accomplishment of a policy objective, but the establishment of a constitutional understanding. Give an example. When he goes to the Senate for advice and consent with respect to some matters concerning the wars in the Western territories with Indian tribes, he goes with Henry Knox, his Secretary at War. They present to the Senate the concerns that the president has. These are all written out, but they're prepared to go personally and stand there. The Senate receives the document and asks the General Knox and the president to step outside while they deliberate inside. So you must see this picture. Washington is out there cooling his heels, waiting for the greatest deliberative body in the world to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to interact with him. He finally gives up on this and says, this is nonsense, gets up, turns around, walks away, and never again appears personally before the Senate. Only works through intermediaries and written communications to seek their advice and consent. Well, that was a critical moment because it established what the relationship would be like between the president and the Senate with regard to this question of advice and consent. We see the same thing in acts throughout the Washington administration, particularly the first term, but not absent in the second term, as I mentioned in a previous segment with regard to the Jay Treaty. But in 1793, with the proclamation of neutrality, we have another case which became a huge public issue. There, war had broken out in Europe. England and France and allied partners throughout Europe were going to war. And the question is, where would the United States stand? The United States had a treaty of alliance, a mutual defense treaty with France from 1778, when France came to the rescue of the United States in the Revolutionary War. French participation was essential. Rochambeau's army went to Yorktown with the American army to prevail in the final battle of the Revolutionary War. This mutual defense treaty was regarded by some, Thomas Jefferson, for example, as morally obliging the United States to stand with France in its hour of need. But George Washington asked a few serious questions. The first question was, how did this war start? Did France start it? And does our treaty oblige us to go with them to war when they start war and not merely when they're defending themselves? An important question. He also asked this, what condition is the United States in to get embroiled in a European war? Would we in fact imperil our very existence? He thought that it was the case, that we were not in a position to get involved in a war, and that we perhaps did not have a moral obligation to enforce that treaty commitment. So he issued what he called a proclamation of neutrality. He says, we are at peace with all the belligerents, and we will take side with neither one. Well, that launched a firestorm of criticism. For the question was asked, what right does the president have to declare a proclamation of neutrality? The Constitution says it is the Congress that has the right to declare war. Does that not imply also a right to declare peace or neutrality? Well, it was a question that hadn't been decided. Washington decided, taking into account that what he was doing was a matter of constitutional interpretation as well as enunciating a policy. Throughout his administration, and I could go on endlessly with this and I won't do that, but let me say, I think it's important to understand, Washington with his cabinet assembled people who came from different perspectives. They were not all of a single faction or party. He had Hamilton and Jefferson, who were soon at loggerheads with one another. He challenged all his members of the cabinet to give him written constitutional opinions when important questions came up. The question of whether there should be a national bank. There was a constitutional debate. He said, write it down, give me an opinion. And then he would make a judgment about whether he would sign the bill or veto the bill based on its constitutionality. The conduct of the administration from start to finish was a conscious, deliberate attempt to give meaning to the contours, the outlines of the Constitution of the United States. George Washington in retirement, that raises an interesting question because George Washington retired frequently. He retired the first time, or at least threatened to, when he was serving in the Virginia militia. He wasn't getting the supplies he thought he needed out on the frontier to defend the Virginians from marauding tribes. And so he headed off to Williamsburg to threaten to quit. He said, I will resign. He threatened to quit when he wasn't being compensated appropriately in comparison with British generals, or British officers, I should say, not generals, because he thought he, as a colonel in the militia, ought to have equivalent standing to those appointees of the king. And if he wasn't going to get it, he would quit. He retired in 1783, when the Revolutionary War ended. He retired, and he said when he retired, I have now spent 8 years in my public service at great personal sacrifice. I want nothing else but to spend the rest of my life in repose on my own land. I will be undisturbed. I will not meddle in public things again. Well, of course, that only lasted through 1787, when he was called to the Constitutional Convention and then subsequently to the presidency. So when 1796 comes and he retires definitively, not that he isn't called on again, he is called once more, but he doesn't go. But when he is definitively in retirement in 1796, it is to return to Mount Vernon. It is to enjoy what had never been out of his mind. Sometimes we think all these retirements were dramatic, histrionic. It's Washington playing a part. But what we neglect is the extent to which he paid attention through all those years of public service to Mount Vernon. He gave detailed instructions to managers about the care of his estate, his farms, and all his properties. He was always anxious about what was going on there through the Revolutionary War, through the time in Washington. He couldn't give enough attention to it. George Washington was a real farmer. There was once an exchange between Washington and Thomas Jefferson in 1796 after they had become estranged because of political partisanship, in which Jefferson, this was leading up to the election, of course, to succeed Washington, and so Jefferson was trying to clear the path, and he wrote a letter to Washington and he said, look, I have the greatest respect for you. I've not been involved in any of these partisan attacks. I just want to assure you that there is no animus on my part. And then Jefferson spoke at some length about his agricultural interests, because we all know what a scientist Thomas Jefferson was. Washington responded to the letter, ignored all the protestations about political innocence, and wrote at great length about farming, agriculture, as if to say, I'll show you who the real farmer is. So when he retires, he really does step right back into it without missing a stride of making sure his properties are well tended and successful. And that has a lot to do with his pulling things back into order sufficient to enable him in his last will and testament to make the provisions that he makes for those slaves as well as for his family members as he had reconstituted, rebuilt his estate. His retirement years were also punctuated by watching political decline. At one point, Jonathan Trumbull writes a letter to him. This is in 1798. And he says, you've got to get back in the game. We're going to lose this next election. The Federalists were divided. Adams was just not effective. We don't know where to turn. We need you. Washington wrote back and he said, if it's men and not principles you need in order to be able to stand and sustain the republic, then it's not worth sustaining. So he would not come back. He was finally, definitively retired.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.